Hello, thank you for joining us for the final series of the CAYL Catalyst webinar. Today, we're going to talk about quality rating and improvement systems, the impacts and the possibilities. I am Jerlene Daniel, serving as your guest host today. I co-chair the NAYC Black Caucus, and I'm a former executive director of NAYC. Currently, I chair the Fred Rogers Production Board, and I spent 18 years as a child care center director. Since 2003, CAYL has led programming that equips professionals in early care and education to create positive and sustainable change for young children. They are guided by these key principles: representative leadership, a commitment to diversity, a focus on solutions, and they want to have an impact and use innovation and build and share knowledge. You will note that these core values are present throughout today's webinar. Here are a few housekeeping details. This session will be recorded, and the recording will be sent to you in a follow-up email. You can access it at the CAYL website, www.cayl.org. Closed captioning is also available. You may click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to enable automatic closed captioning. Please feel free to write in the chat. Where are you from? Where do you work? What is your role? Do you have any questions or comments? Please be sure also to check out the many CAYL resources at cayl.org. Albert Einstein once said, "You can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." With that quote in mind, here is today's agenda. We will spend the majority of our time hearing from our illustrious panel. Remember that the Q&A, the one-on-one with the panel, will take place at the end of the 1-hour webinar, and you'll have a link to connect to that. Let me introduce to you our panel. We will first hear from Ronnie Herndon. He is a longtime activist for minority rights and educational opportunities in Portland. He has served as the director of the Albina, my tongue is tied today, Head Start since 1975. And he previously spent 2 decades as chairman of the board of the National Head Start Association. As a community activist, Ronnie has had an impact not just in the early childhood education field, but in the civil rights movements as well. He founded the Portland chapter of the Black United Front. Ronnie has won a myriad of awards throughout his career of service to others and continues to be an agent for change in our country. We will next hear from Dr. Kelly Etter. Dr. Etter is Vice President of the Early Childhood Equity Initiatives at the Policy Equity Group. Dr. Etter seeks to use her expertise and privilege to create a more just world for young children by challenging systems of oppression and co-designing innovative solutions to transform how we support, honor, and compensate all those who care for children. Her work is informed by her experiences as a teacher, parent, school psychologist, mental health consultant, and therapist and researcher. And last but not least, we will hear from Kimberly Tice. Kimberly has 40 years of experience as an early childhood educator, family child care provider, program director, and executive leader in for-profit and nonprofit early Head Start, faith-based, and public sector. She has touched every aspect of our field, it looks like. Kimberly has been the executive director of the Ohio Association for the Education for Young Children for the past 20 years. In 2017, she became a certified facilitator in the Serving Leader model and established the National Early Childhood Leadership Center, a collaboration with the Center for Serving Leadership to provide leadership development, coaching, and consultation for the early childhood field. As a way of framing our discussion today, let's consider the following. Historically, QRIS was intended to differentiate levels of quality. So for example, one level might be basic health and safety, and another level higher up on the scale might be NAYC accreditation standards. QRS has come to represent a dashboard of easily quantifiable points of reference. So for example, the number and types of degrees among staff. Does the program have a written curriculum? Does it follow a set of standards? The question is, what has been the impact on child care programs, child outcomes, and family decision-making? What have we learned? What do we know? What improvements are needed? And now we'll hear from Ronnie.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. In my opinion, QRIS is not a reliable tool for determining program quality. And I think that we would all be better served if the reset button was hit and we bring together successful early childhood practitioners, and certainly those in academia who are involved in QRIS systems around the country, and individuals from the state that are involved with managing QRIS. If we don't do that, I think we will continue to using a rating system, unfortunately, that is weighted towards people who work for early childhood programs who have degrees. There's nothing wrong with a degree, but in my opinion, there's no indication that there's any correlation between a degree and a good practitioner in the classroom. So I think, again, we should hit that reset button and bring together people from a variety of backgrounds who are involved with QRIS now and say, okay, how can we set this system up so that it actually does give outcomes, or at least monitors outcomes that indicate a program is a program of quality. I do not think that QRIS is doing that now. One example, our program has children from and staff from 35 different countries, speak 25 different languages. We have 80 plus classrooms in 27 different sites. Each time we have to get recertified for QRIS, we have to fill out paperwork for 27 different sites. You would think there would be a way in which you would be only required to fill out paperwork for one site. That's not the case now. And yes, we have been able to make some changes in Oregon because of advocacy from the Head Start community. Head Start programs automatically qualify for the 5-star rating. A friend of mine asked me about 5-star. He said, I'm more accustomed to seeing the star system used in rating hotel rooms. And I thought to myself, I think we can come up with a better way to indicate quality rather than a star rating system. So to conclude, I think the reset button needs to be hit. Practitioners and others who are involved with QRIS, most certainly successful practitioners in the early childhood community, should get together and re-examine the premises, re-examine current practices, and develop a system that we all could depend upon as indicating a quality program in early childhood education. And now we'll hear from Kelly.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. It is truly an honor to be here among these panelists and among all of the audience members. I'm speaking to you today while on the land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Oceti Sakowin people. Wanted to acknowledge that, but wanted to really just talk about kind of my perspectives on QRIS from my unique place in the world. And with my colleagues, we've often kind of talked about some of the wicked problems in the early childhood world and said, do we just need to burn it down and start over? But through talking about it, we've realized, there are a lot of pieces that do work. Lots and lots of effort have come to this point to get to where we are. And so we've come to maybe it's more that we need to be like a 3-year-old in the block area, right? Knock it down and then rebuild it with the existing elements and resources that we have. But I agree with Ronnie, it's a reset that's needed. Some of you might have seen the video series where I literally used blocks to kind of explore this idea of knocking down and rebuilding QRIS, and we can definitely get those links to you if you haven't seen them. But why? Why do we need to reset? Why do we need to knock it down? I really love Minnesota's framing that if a QRIS is working well, it should be accurate, meaningful, and fair. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that from a variety of my perspectives. First, as a self-proclaimed research nerd, talk to you about that. Then from kind of a practical experience, both as the parent of 2 young children, someone who spent a lot of time in classrooms and programs, also as the daughter of an early childhood center director, so I've heard about QRIS over the dinner table, kind of from that perspective. And lastly, as an accomplice and advocate for racial and social justice. So to start with the research, I don't know if any of you have actually read all of the validation studies on QRIS, but I have. Like I said, I'm a research nerd. And Ronnie, you said you don't believe that QRIS is really a reliable or valid kind of representation of quality. And you know what? The research tends to agree with you. So if a QRIS is functioning well, child outcomes should be higher at a 5-star rating than they should be at a 4-star rating, which should be higher than 3, etc. But that's not really what we see. We might see some differences. You read a study and it said, yes, children had better outcomes in a 5-star program than in a 2-star program, but only in approaches for learning. And it wasn't really different from 5 stars to 4 stars or 3 stars to 2 stars. And it didn't really matter for math or literacy. And that's, you see this in study after study, that there really isn't a consistent pattern, that QRIS ratings are predicting child outcomes with any kind of consistency. In fact, we looked at over 500 comparisons across all of these validation studies, looking at differences between the levels of ratings and child outcomes, and only about 8% of them were meaningful, which tells us that QRIS really aren't doing a good job, and it's not just one state, it's across states. So what's going on here, right? So again, to kind of come back to the research rationale of why they aren't working. So one, I think there are 2 major problems. First, that we're not focusing on what matters most for children, and that's teacher-child interactions. We know that from the research. If it is included in states QRIS, it's usually very small focus, and more often we focus on a lot of indirect measures, what Dr. Daniel was calling kind of the dashboard. Sometimes I call it the paper problem. We're really focused on diplomas, handbooks, curricula, even whether or not a program has a bulletin board, but we're really failing to center what matters most for children, these teacher-child interactions, children's direct experiences, right? The second problem is what I call quality soup. Right, so most QRIS are taking all kinds of different factors, different dimensions, from the learning environment to staff credentials, health and safety, family engagement, teacher-child interactions, and they're mushing them all together in this one score. And what happens is that things get really muddy really fast because health and safety indicators, those predict rates of illness and injury, not math development. And a language-rich environment in the classroom, critical for literacy development, doesn't necessarily predict what you might want to see in family engagement outcomes. So all of these dimensions are important, but when you mix them up, you can't predict any one thing very well. And so when you're measuring everything, you're measuring nothing. And the same thing, this kind of quality soup notion that when you're looking at different classrooms within a program, research has actually shown that variations in quality are greater within a program than across programs. So again, the experience of one child in a program is not going to be the experience of a child down the hall, and maybe not even two children in the same classroom are having that same experience. So aggregating all of this data into one score just isn't very accurate. And that's why we see that QRIS just aren't really working the way that we intended for them to. So what does this mean from a practical perspective if QRIS aren't working the way that they're supposed to? At best, I think it means that we're just not providing very useful information for families or programs, but at worst, it's actually harmful. Ronnie spoke to kind of these unnecessary burdens that programs are experiencing, and it's also misrepresenting the level of services and care and quality that they're offering. So it kind of brings you to the parent perspective. You know, as a parent with two young children, I tried to use QRIS, but I didn't find it very helpful. You know, my personal anecdote is I found a great program, 4-star program. It was wonderful for my daughter, but it was a Montessori program and it had wonderful kind of literacy and math experiences. But I happen to have a kid who lives in an imaginary world of dragons and inventions. And for those of you that are familiar with Montessori, a block is a block. It's not a train, it's not a phone. Sociodramatic play just isn't really a focus in programs like that. And so it just wasn't a good fit for my family. It was a fantastic program, wasn't a good fit for my family. You know, I also had a colleague who was distraught when she learned the program she had enrolled her child in was a 1-star program. But I was like, hold on, let's dig a little. And in her state, all licensed programs are 1-star, and any kind of participation above that is voluntary. And so indeed, she went and talked to her provider, and it was like, yeah, I have to be 1-star to be licensed, but honestly, it's just not worth it for me to go anywhere beyond that. But my friends felt so betrayed by the QRIS in her state, and I can really relate to that, and I think a lot of parents can. And ultimately, I think when we talk about star ratings as supportive of family choice, I think that's really unfair. I don't think that a choice between a 2-star and a 5-star program is really a choice. Every family would pick 5 stars if they could, but cost, location, hours that come with a lot of privilege are what drive choices for most families. So what are we doing? Are we shaming the families and the providers that are in those 1-star, those 2-star programs? And if we could fix all the problems kind of with access, I think true choice would look much more like, what do I want? What is the best fit for my child, for my family? Is it that I want a program that specializes in working with children with disabilities or multilingual children? Is it that I really want a farm to ECE program? Is it a provider that speaks my family's languages? Or, you know, aligns with my values in some other way. So I think that's true choice. I don't think what we're giving now is choice for families. And right now choice is, like I said, a privilege. This brings me to my final point that QRIS are really an equity issue. We know that meeting quality standards takes resources, and resources are often tied to racist institutions and systems, things like higher education, financial lending practices, consequences of redlining in neighborhoods where the programs and the families are. And, you know, definitions of quality and requirements are often based in white dominant cultural norms. And so we just see all these inequities in what's going into these ratings of so-called quality. And, you know, the research, there's starting to be an emerging body of research showing the effects of these disparities. So in one state, you know, lower rated programs are more likely to be owned by Black, Indigenous, or a person of color individual and attended by BIPOC children compared to white owners and white children. Another state, programs serving children receiving subsidies were more likely to receive lower ratings. So think about this from an incentive and kind of tiered quality or a tiered reimbursement perspective. And indeed, another state found that when you looked at the average tiered reimbursement by child race, because of those differences in ratings, there are significant funding gaps by child race perpetuated by QRIS. So in conclusion, really, you know, if QRIS are ineffective and inequitable, why are they still standing? I think that my call to action is hitting pause on QRIS, knocking down the current structures and rebuilding. If I were to kind of design this process, I think it would be done in phases. It's going to take time. I think the first thing that we need to do is focus on pay, compensation, stabilizing the workforce. We know that that's the root of a lot of problems right now. And before we do that, do not pass go. Second, I think really focusing on essential elements of quality and how can we give programs the resources and funding that they need to engage in quality, and trusting them to use those resources and not making it contingent on them jumping through hoops. And then lastly, this is when we've kind of put those two things in place, stabilization, support, then we can talk about specialization. And thinking about, what's important to families and how can programs really celebrate their strengths. And so to do that, I really think that, as Ronnie said, this is a co-design process. It's not a bunch of people in a room who look like me, white, middle-class, middle-aged women with advanced degrees. It's really being inclusive, flipping the power structures, going beyond kind of the token parents and providers on an advisory board. This is going to take a radical new way of working and imagining together to rebuild. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Kimberly. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I was on the work group many years ago when Ohio was first developing its quality rating system. We had high hopes that it would be a tool to help parents identify quality programs for their children and to help programs to start on a path of continuous quality improvement that had them always working to become a program that delivers on the promise of early childhood education. Were we naive? Did we not give enough consideration to the unintended consequences of the system we were creating? Maybe. I believe we made the best decisions that we could with the information that we had at the time. However, as my mother used to say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. One of the stated purposes of QRIS is to increase the parents' knowledge and ability to choose high quality programs for their child. However, in my experience, the reality is that many parents, even my own family members, are more likely to make their decision based on word of mouth, location, and affordability than a program's star rating. And a parent's definition of what quality means to them often differs from the established quality benchmarks for QRIS. Early childhood educators understand the need for rules and regulations, yet we often hear that these same dedicated early childhood educators are complaining about the QRIS system and don't want to be held accountable by completing necessary documentation. I'd like to suggest that we look at this issue from a professional practice perspective. The NAEYC Code of Ethics outlines each educator's responsibility to provide care and education in settings that are safe, healthy, nurturing, and responsive for each child. And the Code of Ethics reminds us that when policies are enacted for purposes that do not benefit children, we have a collective responsibility to work to change these policies. And our early childhood educators have identified that when standards are duplicative, rigid, and time-consuming, it interferes with their ability to provide optimal care for children and families. When providers find the system to be more streamlined and easier to engage with, they're more likely to participate fully and stay committed. The time saved by programs translates to teachers having more time to engage in positive interactions with children to support their learning and development. Rather than a strength-based system where programs can highlight how they offer quality in multiple ways, programs are often funneled into a system that is more focused on checking a box and completing paperwork to demonstrate they are meeting the state's definition of quality. We should recognize that there are multiple ways to demonstrate quality. Programs should be provided with flexibility to provide tangible evidence of meeting QRIS standards in ways that are individualized to their program setting and type. While Ohio and other states across the country have increased accountability in their QRIS system for educators by raising expectations and educational requirements, they've frequently done so without sufficiently attending to increased compensation. By meeting higher quality standards and completing degrees, early childhood educators are keeping their end of the bargain, but still earning poverty level wages. I believe we must flip our understanding of quality and put educators in the center. To care about children and families is to care about the professionals who support, care for, and educate them. Dr. Junlei Lee of the Harvard Graduate School of Education asserts that we can't make a lasting impact on children by skipping over the adults in the middle. Valora asked me to share Ohio's story over the past year or so. In our state, we have spent the last year trying to protect our quality rating system, even while we know at the same time the program itself needs many improvements. During the last budget cycle, the Senate president made a move to dismantle and defund the system, publicly stating that babysitting was good enough. The plan was to use the state's investment in our QRIS system in other areas of the budget, not childcare. During a pandemic, advocates were able to pause his efforts through a compromise to create a study committee to evaluate the system, reduce administrative burden for programs, and increase access for families, all laudable goals. For the past year, the committee has heard testimony from state agencies, advocates, business leaders, and childcare providers. The final report is due this month. While we don't expect the report to be transformative, a year-long process occurred where legislators met monthly and were educated on the challenges inherent in the QRIS system, as well as the broken childcare system itself. While there were certainly recommendations to reduce administrative burden, the most recurring messages the committee heard were that the entire childcare system has been underfunded for so long and the workforce so underpaid that it's unrealistic for them to expect that our QRS system will achieve the expected outcomes for children on a shoestring budget. The committee heard that childcare programs were open, but not okay. Stabilization grants provided funds to keep them from closing, but because of the staffing crisis, few were operating at full capacity. Childcare providers were thankful for the stabilization grants. To motivate our advocacy, we used a mantra from Abby Wambach's book, Wolfpack. Be thankful for what you have and demand what you deserve. While reducing administrative burden was important, the providers and advocates held a mirror up to the legislators to stress that additional state investment is needed to address the root of the problem and not just tinker around the edges if they're truly concerned about quality and increasing access to families. The policymaking process often fails to authentically include those who are most directly impacted by the policies designed for them. Early childhood educator voices are missing from conversations where decisions are made about policies that directly impact their practice and well-being. If we are to improve QRIS systems, we must continually assess whose voices are being heard and whose voices are absent in decision-making and address the conditions that create barriers for participation. Strategies that center family and provider voices are essential to addressing bias and advancing equity in state policies such as the QRIS system itself. When decision makers have access to the real life experiences of families and providers, they can create more equitable policies that everyone can benefit from. If we are to make meaningful changes to the QRIS system, We must center educator voices and move to a provider-driven system where they are engaged and prioritized in leadership and decision-making throughout the state's early childhood system. I'd like to leave you with this story. Among the most accomplished and fabled tribes of Africa, no tribe was considered to have warriors more fearsome or more intelligent than the Maasai tribe. It is perhaps surprising then to learn the traditional greeting that passed between Maasai warriors. And how are the children? It is still the traditional greeting among the Maasai, acknowledging the high value that the Maasai always place on their children's well-being. Even warriors with no children of their own would always give the traditional answer: all the children are well. Meaning, of course, that the priorities of protecting the young are in place. I wonder how it might affect our own children's welfare if in our culture we took to greeting each other with the daily question, and how are the children? I wonder if we heard that question and passed it along to each other a dozen times a day, if it would begin to make a difference in the reality of how the children are thought of or cared about in our own country. I wonder if every adult among us, parent and non-parent alike, felt an equal weight for the daily care and protection of all children in our communities, in our towns, in our states, and in our country. I wonder if we could honestly say without hesitation, the children are well. Yes, all the children are well. As issues around QRIS are debated in our country, I encourage everyone to ask first and foremost, how are the children, as we guide this work? And now we're going to move to the group discussion.
I'd like to encourage everyone to turn on your cameras. We like to have the group discussion be relatively informal, and so if we can see you, that would be great. It could be that I've given you that cue too soon, but when you can, please turn on your cameras. I'd like to thank our illustrious panel. You've all given us something to think about, but what you've also done is there's a theme across all three of your presentations. And I guess I'd like to start with you, Ronnie, because one of the things that we've been saying is that QRS does not present an accurate picture of the quality. I sometimes think of childcare programs as having personalities as well, you know, kind of steeped in whatever is the culture or the neighborhood. So Ronnie, setting aside QRS and the stars, what is it that a parent or the public would miss in knowing about the Albina program? What's beyond or behind those stars? How would you describe the essence of your program?
Well, I think if they were able to just meet our staff, 60+% of our staff, we have now close to 400 staff people, 60+% are people of color. And no, I'm sorry, take that back. 90+% are people of color, 65+ are current or former Head Start parents. And that's not an accident. We think that parents who have interacted with our program know our program best, and they will probably have a sense of loyalty to our program above folks who have very little interaction with our program. And when I share that we're now at 65%, many people jump to the conclusion, oh, that must mean that the majority of those folks are teacher assistants. No, they go all the way from our fiscal department, heading other departments down into the classroom. So current and former Head Start current and Head Start parents are represented all throughout our program. This certainly has strengthened our program. And as I mentioned earlier, our staff come from 30+ different countries speak 25 different languages. And that's a strength for our program and our connection with a variety of communities. That's not going to be reflected in one of those star hotel ratings. That you're not going to see that. So that's just one example. And I'll end with, we're very proud of our Mandarin immersion program that we have. We've had it now for almost 10 years, in which children are immersed, Head Start children are immersed in learning, reading, writing Mandarin. And when we first began the program, someone asked me, well, why do you expect these children to learn Chinese? I said, well, beyond a country currently that has 1.4 billion people and a huge economy, I think it would be nice for people in this country to be able to speak to possibly their bankers in the future. So we are trying to prepare children, not for now, but for what we can't see, which is their future. So those are elements of our program that you're not going to see with one of the, as I call them, one of the hotel stars rating.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you've given us a very vivid picture. Now multiply that by all the childcare centers across the country, and what a rich mosaic we'd have if we could get past these stars. You know, Kelly, there was a question in the chat. Two questions really. One person wants to know what is working with QRS, and the other wanted to know if you would expand a bit on the research that is that you mentioned. And then what we will do, if you'll send us the references or the citations, we can get that out to people in an email. So you can start with either question.
Love that. Well, I want to start with what is working, because I think, as I spoke about a little bit, I don't want to burn it all down. I think there are things that are working, and that's why I love this idea of kind of knocking it down and rebuilding with the pieces, because I think the intent of QRS, something that conveys to families, I think, as Ronnie was just saying, there are things that families are looking for, and they want to know, you know, I'm not just going to send my child to any program. I would love for it to be somewhere that aligns with my values and the needs of my family and child. So I think a means of communicating that, but exactly that, Ronnie, like, the stars aren't going to capture the beautiful story that you were telling about who your staff are and what values you hold. I think there are ways that we can do that. And I saw a question come in the chat too about something around, as I was saying, like more specializations, right? So in the medical profession, they use specializations that, you know, you're not just kind of a general practitioner. Some programs are amazing at and passionate at social emotional learning, or maybe they have specializations around languages, as Ronnie was saying. Maybe they do farm to early care and education. There are a lot of different things that they can celebrate and say, we do this really well, and for parents to be able to align that with their values. So I think that idea of creating a bridge between families and programs is important. I think the idea of we want something and we want to continually to strive to get better at it, I think that's a very laudable thing. I think maybe we're just looking at the wrong end goals. I have very similar thoughts around the BA, Ronnie, as I think that you do. I think there are a lot of different ways we can explore that. And lastly, you know, resources. You know, states really do want to put resources back into programs. I think that's the intent around tiered reimbursement. I think that the way that it's structured is not working and creates inequities. I think even you know, it comes on the back end. We ask programs to do this and then we'll give you money, when we know that to make any changes toward whatever your vision of quality is, you need a down payment. You need that on the front end, an investment. So I think that those key premises of QRS are working, or could work, I guess. But I think that the way that they're structured, we're veering off track a little bit. I did put in the chat some of the articles that I was talking about in terms of the inequities. I know that CAYL will send that out as well. There's one that I mentioned that was kind of an internal, couple that I mentioned that were internal studies. Happy to talk more offline if you want more information about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Terry, can I add to that answer about?
Yes,
what is
please do.
working? One of the things we've seen in our conversations, I mean, every program's different, but for some programs, this was an opportunity that they did not see a clear pathway to improve their programs and services. For some programs, that has given them that structure to do that. And particularly in our conversations with family childcare providers and some of the smaller centers, they've taken real pride in what they've achieved. And in a profession that doesn't get valued enough and recognized enough, I do believe that that is one of the things for some of the programs have really felt like it was an opportunity to be recognized by someone outside their clientele, that they really were making efforts on the pathway to quality.
You know, Kim, it's interesting that you mentioned family childcare, because I was just going to ask you a question about family childcare. I know that when I was a young mother in search of care while I went back to school and so forth, I chose family childcare because it felt so much more personal to me at the time, because my children were under 3, you know, and they were only 15 months apart. So I was looking for somebody who I thought got us. Does that make sense? You know, and so each of you have mentioned cultural elements in terms of appropriateness for a given family or a given child. And I'm wondering, do you think of family childcare as a potential source of that connectedness, what works for a given family? You know, Ronnie has said within his program, there are so many different languages and peoples, and they found a way to connect even in a much larger system. What are you thinking about family childcare?
I think you're right on target. What we've seen is because of the small program setting, and also because family childcare providers really see themselves as, you know, a beating heart of their community itself, that they are able to be more flexible in meeting the cultural needs of families. They're part of the community themselves. Some people choose, as you said, do I want a childcare program that has 5 stars, or do I want a family childcare program, I'm just using an example, that has 3 stars, but speaks the language of my children and feeds them the cultural foods that we have in our home? That makes a lot of sense. I think the flip side to family childcare and quality rating systems is they were created for the centers. And then they're like, okay, let's just kind of tweak them a little and say, here you go, family childcare. And the very thing that makes family childcare so wonderful, the home-like setting, they want to turn them into little childcare centers. You know, when I did family childcare, and it was long before the QRIS system, trust me, I mean, I did have a little area where we did messy play, but they hung out on my couch. They hung out on my living room floor. I didn't have centers all around my home. And I think that sometimes QRIS, I'd like to see it, you know, started from scratch, particularly with family childcare in mind, and say, what does this look like for a family childcare provider? What does quality look like in their home, and create it specific to them? Kelly, I also see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that a few years ago, I attended a wonderful webinar from Childcare Aware of America, where Keisha Nzui, who's with the California Resource and Referral Network, gave a phenomenal presentation where she ended it, QRIS is racist. And that was like her mic drop. But part of her point was that not only is it for centers and like sometimes for family childcare providers, but in no way acknowledges family, friend, and neighbor care, which are disproportionately Black and brown women, immigrant women, where a lot of families, that's where they want, particularly their younger children. But QAS and kind of early childhood systems in general are saying, this is a legitimate form of care and this is not a legitimate form of care. And again, that kind of hierarchy and judgment toward both the families and the providers that are providing that care. Sometimes we talk about childcare deserts, but the kids aren't just walking around with tumbleweeds around them. People are caring for them. And I have a wonderful colleague in New Mexico who said, deserts are very nurturing ecological systems. And I think that's just like family, friend, and neighbor care, and to some extent the family child care sector that's often left out of these discussions. And so I just wanted to kind of uplift that perspective as well.
One of the things that each of you talked about was representative voices from the field in building this system. And so, Ronnie, I want to go back to you. What would you suggest in terms of strategies for making sure certain voices are heard? Are there communities or communities of voices, whether it's parents, providers, or whomever, that you would want to be sure we're at the table, and so that we could make the nuanced and sometimes very drastic changes that may be needed? What would you suggest in terms of pulling those voices in?
Dr. Daniel, I think we listen to whomever we want, and we bring to the table whomever we want. And in most cases, they're not people that look like me and you, or the communities that you and I come from, or people are very selective about, even from certain communities, who they invite to the table. When I was listening to the conversation about family child care, it made me think we have contractual relationships with probably 30, let's say 30 different child care providers, many of them family child care providers. And several years ago, a lady who was running early learning division here in Oregon, she asked me, we were talking about that. She said, well, could I meet them? That's the first time anybody had ever said that to me. And I said, sure. We set up a dinner meeting, invited people to come and meet with her and actually talk about problems that they were faced with, many of which you've heard today. And she began to look at ways in which direct assistance could be given to those programs. Unfortunately, she left before that could be cemented. I think if we are really honest, we can get people at the table that need to be at the table if that's what we want to accomplish. Now, if we just want to put the veneer of respectability on an existing system, we also can get those people and invite them in for snacks and coffee and rubber stamp ideas that they have developed. But if someone is honest, they say, hey, we have questions about this system. We were well-intended when we put it together. We have serious questions about this. We want to bring in the people who right now are the recipients of our institutional largesse, QRS, and tell us directly what needs to be changed. So I think, Dr. Daniel, it can be done. But I have doubts that it will be done because there's so much investment, especially when you bring the university systems into it and all of the savants that they have in early childhood education that bring them into the equation, plus the contracts they have, that not many people want to rock the boat who are recipients of the contracts. So I don't think, well, put it this way, I hope it will be a Christmas miracle.
Kim, did you want to add to that?
Well, gee, it's hard to follow that after that comment, but I think, we need to work towards that Christmas miracle no matter what. And I think we have been learning better how to do this. One of the things that we used to say, at Ohio AYC, we advocate on behalf of the early childhood workforce. And I think what we really learned during the pandemic was that we needed to empower them to tell their own stories and to not tell their stories for them. And so having those conversations with people and bringing them to the table has made a difference. I'm going to use one example that we had some real challenges with the stabilization grants for both family child care providers and centers. And after discussing this with them, we set up a meeting with the decision makers at our state agency. We empowered these individuals by creating some talking points ahead of time. What point did they want to make? What stories did they want to tell? And we had the meeting. It was a virtual meeting like this. I'd like to tell you it went perfectly. There were times where it went off the rails, didn't go exactly according to the talking points, but the decision makers heard directly from this group. And the piece I love most about it was the decision makers assumed, like one of the asks was, they thought that family child care providers needed to receive a more equitable amount in these stabilization grants. And we did not plan this part, but the state agency said, well, that would mean that centers would get less. And the providers who were from centers who were on the call said, but we hear what they're saying and they're correct. And if that means we need to take less, we would do that. Well, they wouldn't have heard that if they weren't telling their own story rather than us trying to share for them. So I think, one of the other pieces we're trying to do is, and by the way, we did talk to the state agency afterwards and said, we know it got a little messy, but if we want people to tell their stories and you want to respect their perspectives, then we've got to grow together in this. So we're trying to get them at the tables, but it also takes, we have some leadership cohorts that we're trying to build their capacity to feel confident in telling their stories and be agents of change. So I agree with Ron, it's far from where it needs to be now. Those of us with privilege need to use the opportunities we have. A lot of times when people are asking me to serve on a committee now, I look to see who isn't represented that I could encourage to sit at that table rather than myself. And it's been very rewarding to do that.
I'd like to now ask, throw this out to our broader audience and ask people to turn on their cameras. And if there are questions from the audience, maybe we can get to one or two of those. I know there are people looking at the chat, and hopefully there are some questions there.
Dr. Daniel, my understanding is, and maybe we could go to the Zoom meeting early. They can't turn on until we go to the Zoom meeting.
Oh,
but we could certainly go to it early if that works for Elizabeth, who's working with us.
That might be a good idea. Elizabeth, you need to signal us. While she's getting back to us, I think what I want to send, I will send to the folks at CAYL something that they can put out in an email that a person named Defina Lazarus Stewart says that words that we use interchangeably, diversity, inclusion, equity, and so forth, really all ask different questions. And if we understood the questions they ask, we might be better equipped to fill the rooms with the folks who need to be there. Well, I want to thank our panelists for that robust discussion, and we will go earlier momentarily to the broader room so that we can engage more people in the Q&A. In wrapping up this conversation, I think you've, well, not wrapping up, in transitioning to the next part of this conversation, I hope that you've been able to see that we've been talking about representative and diverse leadership, getting the people into the room who can make a real difference with the real experience. And when we do that, we have an impact and we can be innovative. And we build on our knowledge base and can be more focused on actual solutions. There will be the Q&A is next, and in the last slide, I believe, they'll show you how to get to the Q&A. All right, we'll move there now.